This presentation came about as a result of some stand-up comedy and book promotion tour I did in England last week. I arrived there basically to talk about my new book, Valpurgis Night Volume 1, and quite a lot of people, while I was there, asked me about Vikings. There seems to be a real interest in Vikings in the UK at the moment, based a lot on this new TV show called, well, not new, it's only new to me, I only saw it the first few episodes last week, I didn't even know it existed, called Vikings, and they asked me how true it was, because I've had to do a fair bit of rudimentary research into Viking theology in order to demonstrate in the new book, Valpurgis Night Volume 1, how the theocratic religious cult aspects of National Socialism, such as the SS, basically took it and perverted it for a political agenda, as National Socialism itself was the most successful form of socialism to actually capture people's minds, for the simple reason that it was a sort of a religious weaponized version of socialism. It basically took the socialist ideas and wrapped it around an occult religious framework, and that's why it sold so well. And a major part of this was the corruption of Nordic Viking theology and culture. My feelings towards the Vikings is that they were actually liberators. They were liberating Europe from Christianity. So the Vikings, were they total vicious bastards? Well, ask a Christian and you get your answer to that one. According to Christianity, which is the main source for the counter-propaganda of the Viking races, they were monsters. But you'll never get a fair answer, because you're dealing with a propaganda mindset. Christians have successfully created this idea that they are noble and saintly and peace-loving. The reality is that Christianity, through the moment from St. Peter arrived in Rome, and maybe even before that, was basically a death cult based on mass murder and conversions. Now, even the early Christian kings like Charlemagne committed acts of human rights atrocities and genocide that was far worse than anything the Vikings ever did, against non-Christians such as the Saxons who refused to convert. The simple reason for that is that Christianity was so delicious to the aristocracy, particularly the post-Norman aristocracy of Europe, in that it allowed fundamentally to entrench the idea that a king is the one true God on earth. One true God in heaven, one true God on earth. And this is why Christianity has been steadfastly associated with European royal families and even American presidents ever since. So you'll never get a fair answer from a Christian. Now, I watched some of that TV series, The Vikings, and the first episode gave an account of the 793 Viking raid on the Christian monastery of Lindisfarne in the Kingdom of Northumbria in the north of England, on the north east coast of England. If you read the accounts of the time, it was essentially the 9/11 of its day. It was quite a traumatic event, not only for the monks involved, but also for the power structures within Northumbria and throughout the Anglo-Saxon lands. The main reason being was that the Vikings were not Christianized. The Vikings did attack the monastery, they did kill some monks, they did take others as slaves. Slavery was an intrinsic part of the Viking system, as it was part of every other culture. They showed no veneration or respect for the religious artifacts or the Christian aspects of. This shocked the people at the time. The reason why it shocked the kingdom particularly was because, let's talk about what Lindisfarne was. Lindisfarne was the Jim Jones, Jonestown, Branch Davidians. It was a cult compound of its day, as all these early Christian monasteries were at first. Later on, they became quite enlightened bastions of even science and things like that, but in the initial early Christian period they were simply cult compounds. Now, they were useful cult compounds to the prevailing kingdoms, because kings on these islands instantly recognized the usefulness of Christianity in order to control their people. So they were a tolerated cult. This idea of cults being tolerated and being created by intelligence services and the leaderships continues to this day, specifically since the 1960s, where you have the CIA, the French Secret Service, and MI5 deliberately cultivating and creating cults, for the simple reason that if you have a dissident group and individuals who are highly educated and are a real danger to the control grid, it's much better for the control grid to have them waiting for the coming of a second Christ, comet clusters, or UFOs, or aliens, or whatever. They want the smart minds doing that, because once they're tied up in that, they're not going to threaten the establishment. And that was the purpose of Lindisfarne. That's why it was very appealing to early British and Celtic and basically a lot of Western European kings at the time. So it was literally seen as the 9/11 of its day. That's a painting I did of Lindisfarne a few years back. It was to give the idea of what Lindisfarne looked like the night before the Viking raid took place. When you look at the Viking world conquest, it is truly staggering. The idea that these were mindless barbarians quickly vanishes when you look at the land masses and the oceans that they conquered. They were not called Vikings back then. That term appeared later. They were called the Askomani by the Teutons, that's the Germans, the Lochnalach by the Gaels, the Rus by the Slavics and Arabs, and the Dane by the Anglo-Saxon. The Russian aspect, the Rus, is very interesting because the Vikings essentially, on their way to Baghdad, which is incredible when you think about it considering the times, and Constantinople, they discovered the Russian nation on the way, or should I say they invented it. To bring that into perspective, they would have sailed across the Gulf of Finland into the area that's now around St. Petersburg, followed the Russian river systems down the country as best they could, the Dnieper and the Volga. There were vast sections where there was no river system. As amazing as this sounds, they literally took up their Viking longships and carried them on their backs, upside down, and they served as both houses and fortifications while they cross land. Now just think about that, the physical strength needed to carry a Viking longship on your backs, and they did it for thousands of miles. They founded some of the most important cities in the world, York at the time, Dublin. The list just goes on. They discovered Iceland, Greenland, which is a different climate back then, and of course they discovered America, and that's now clearly well established. And anyone who still believes the Christopher Columbus 1492 sailed the ocean blue, they're really haven't studied their history. If you can say nothing else about the Vikings and their conquests between 800 AD and 1066, and you all know why 1066 is a pivotal date. If nothing else, their exploration just leaves you one awestruck. And that's before we get to anything else, such as their technology and their culture, their arts, and every other system they operated with. The reason why 1066 is so pivotal is because it was the Battle of Hastings. The Battle of Stamford Bridge first, and then the Battle of Hastings. And the Normans who had invaded England were descendants. They were a Christianized, Middle Easternized version of Vikings that had moved south. By that time they had discovered Christianity and brought that infection en masse to England and then later to Ireland. The reason why the Normans, particularly for me personally, fill me with revulsion is because the Normans brought nothing. Culturally, they brought nothing except taxes and laws. The two things that still exist to this day. Taxes and laws. So by 1066, we had a cultural legacy of a seafaring and land crossing culture and technology that was known to the Zoroastrians of Iraq all the way across the Atlantic to the Shinnecock Indians in North America. This is a Viking longship that I took photographs on a visit to in Dublin about 8 years ago, I think it was. This was the Sea Stallion. It was a replica built at the Roskilde Viking Boat Museum, which is a phenomenal facility in Denmark, well worth visiting, where they still build Viking ships according to the technology of their time. This was a replica of a ship that was built in Dublin and then was sailed. The original was built in Dublin. A replica was built in Roskilde in Denmark, and it was sailed across the North Sea and then down the west coast of Scotland and into Dublin to celebrate the Viking heritage of the city. Dublin is one of the most Viking cities in the world. The ship itself, I've walked on this ship, I've explored it, and you cannot believe the quality of the workmanship. Now we're talking about 1,000-plus-year-old technology here. The streamlined nature of the ship allows the ship to basically skirt across the water, very similar to a sailboard. This allows high speed, but a sail can be quickly taken down in a storm and used as a giant canvas cover to keep the interior and the men and the women inside dry. It's very utilitarian, but it's got a sense of dynamic design about it. This signifies the Viking mindset that on one hand, necessity forced them to basically leave the coastal margins of Scandinavia in search of survival, essentially. It was very well thought out. There was nothing... These were not just boats that had been randomly developed over time. They were specifically designed and engineered for the purpose. And as I mentioned in a previous slide, just think the people in that boat would have carried that on their backs across Russia if they had to, and many times they did. Now, there was a social structure, a hierarchy within Viking society that was very interesting. You had at the lower end the thralls, who were the slave system. These were people that would have been captured slaves. This is where the term slave comes from. It comes from the Nordic or Viking Slav. People in the Slavic countries been taken over and brought to Scandinavia and elsewhere as slaves. They would have had no rights. Basically, their lives would have been just to do the kind of menial jobs, farm labouring, construction labouring, and so on. The next layer up would have been the Carls. These are farmers and fishermen and tradesmen. These have been skilled craftsmen, people with small holdings. There was a tremendous level of economic freedom in farming under the Viking system, in the sense that if you had your own farm, you were remarkably independent compared to, say, what came along much later under the Anglo-Norman system with the Land Enclosure Acts in England and France and Ireland. You also had the ability to challenge the aristocratic class, the Jarls. These were people who were basically the aristocratic elites of their time, but however, they were a very different kind of kingship than we have in these parasitic Romano-Prussian aristocrats we have today. A Carl, say, a warrior or a soldier, could actually challenge a Jarl in terms of a fight, and could actually challenge him and take over his kingdom. This is if you were a king or an aristocrat in Nordic social structure, you made sure that in many cases, you had to fight or defend that. You didn't sit in a big palace collecting taxes, as the Norman system decreed later on. You earned your kingship. As a result, the aristocrats there had a higher level of respect among the lower classes that do not exist that's never existed within the Romano-Prussian aristocratic setup. They would fight on the battlefield next to you. It was not a case of them on high as God's representative of Earth. However, there was dark sides to it. There's no perfect society, and we are talking 1,000 years ago. Aristocrats could take their procession to Odin's long hall at Asgard, to Valhalla, and they could also have their slaves, their thralls, killed and sent with them. So there's often been Viking graves found of aristocrats, and inside it would be the slaves who were killed to go serve their master in Valhalla, in Odin's long hall. The Valkyrie were basically, the term means selectors of the slain or takers of the slain. These were a kind of a mythological witch angel type archetype who came down from heaven to take the souls of Vikings up into Valhalla. Now, they're closely associated with ravens, mainly because ravens appear at battlefields as they are carrion. And so there's a strong connection to the raven with the Valkyrie, which is also common in the Gaelic on Morrigan. On Morrigan was the raven that landed on the shoulders of Cuchulainn, the great hero of the Irish saga, the Táin. He wasn't a Viking, but there's so many similarities and crossovers here, which is probably one of the reasons the Vikings were so successful, because they carried with them a warrior archetype nature, which carried very well into cultures where there were conquests. Hugin and Murin, perched upon the shoulders of Odin, often described and pictured this way, are two ravens on each shoulder, and they would be the ones sent down to take the souls of the slain and bring them to Valhalla. The Valkyrie, you all know that from the famous opera by Richard Wagner, the din 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 of Apocalypse Now fame. It just goes to show you how strong and how resilient the Nordic archetypes have been. We will talk about this in a minute, that these imageries and these archetypes have actually not only survived through Christianity and Western civilization and the growth of industry, but also made it very strongly, surprisingly strongly, into even Hollywood films, as in Apocalypse Now and The Ride of the Valkyries, as the helicopter gunships attack the Vietnamese village. Odin, or Wotan, the main god, the main deity, the main archetype, supernatural figure on high of the Viking people, is like so all the Nordic gods is very, very interesting. Now, Odin gave up his right eye and hung upside down on the Yggdrasil tree for 9 days and nights to attain wisdom. He also hung by the one leg. It was almost like a suffering. You see, it's the Jesus archetype again. Jesus attained salvation through suffering and salvation for humanity. Odin did the same thing, as did Krishna. And so, again, we import these archetypes from the Middle East and we have all this religion here. It's very interesting how Odin of Wotan appears in the tarot as the hanged man. And here he is hanging upside down, and you see the halo around his head, one eye closed, attaining enlightenment. This is one of the reasons I'm a major proponent of the tarot, is because it is the book of Western archetypes, and all the gods and goddesses and archetypes all appear in the cards, particularly in the 22 of the major arcana. In Old English it was Wodan, in Old Saxon it was Wotan, and in the Old High German Wotan. Again, he was a god you could have a beer with, just like Thor was. Their gods were similar to their aristocratic class on Earth. You could have a drink with Odin and Thor. You couldn't have a drink with Jesus Christ. They were supernatural archetypes, but they were not distant. They were someone you could see down in the street. In the way they use this term today, he or she has the Christ consciousness in them. Well, everyone and all of society had the Odin or Thor or Siv or Loki archetype within them. A much more accessible theology. And the Odin archetype has made its way into popular culture. I noticed this when I first saw the movie Gangs of New York, that Bill the Butcher Cutting, played brilliantly by Daniel Day-Lewis, was an Odin archetype. In fact, the beginning of that movie is basically a battle between the Gaels and the Vikings. In many ways, it's a reenactment of the Battle of Clontarf, which took place in Dublin when Brian Boru ousted the Vikings and sent them to Merseyside, particularly the Wirral. If you want to see places in the world that are still strongly Viking, one would be the Wirral, the area just west of Liverpool in England, which was a Viking kingdom, as was the Isle of Man, although that's been very heavily corrupted by Freemasonry. This battle scene between the natives, led by Bill the Butcher Cutting, against the Irish Catholic immigrants, led by Liam Neeson, the character or the actor Daniel Day-Lewis definitely invokes the Odin archetype. He's got one eye missing. He walks with a limp, so he's hanging on one leg. He is defending his people. The opening scene he's defending his people basically against popery. He's really defending against Roman popery. So we have basically the battle between the Nordics and the Christians, the Middle Eastern Abrahamic Christian archetypes, in the cold on the streets of New York. York was as we'll see later, was a Viking town, Jorvik. These directors in Hollywood, such as Martin Scorsese, they don't miss a trick. These are highly educated, intelligent people. It's interesting that they're wearing the stovepipe hats and a sash around their waist, which is blue, Prussian blue. Interesting as well, in terms of my own work of how the Nordic thing was corrupted by a form of Middle Eastern Christianity. Well, all Christianity is Middle Eastern, but the Odin archetype comes across very strongly in this character, very strongly. He's not just a psychopathic murderer. He's actually carries with him a lot of decency and wisdom, and he's doing what he strongly believes needs to be done to preserve the freedoms of his people. He sleeps with one eye open. I mean, that's extremely Odin, but he's just not just a violent thug until the very end, when the scene where he kills the elected politician played by Brendan Gleeson. That was almost significant, indicative of the fact that the Viking, the Nordic, can never exist in tandem with this sort of Christian democracy. One or other has to go. Ragnarok. Now, this is basically the Viking end of the world, the apocalypse, and this is a quote from my book Valpurgis Night. Lewis Spence proposed the Nazi cult venerated the worship of the deities Odin, Wotan, Loki and Thor. He wrote a book called Occult Causes of the Present War in 1940, warning the British establishment that the National Socialists had very successfully tapped into Teutonic and Nordic archetypes, corrupted them into a form of black magic, and this was basically what was driving groups like the SS and the Gestapo. Much to their regret, the British and all the other European establishments discovered this too late. Well, it wasn't their regret, it was the people like Churchill were just as bad, but it was the soldiers that had to go and fight them, were basically fighting a very different mindset, particularly in the Battle of France when the British Expeditionary Force encountered the SS for the first time. The destructive nature of Loki was particularly appealing to the SS death cult, as Fenrir, the son of Loki, is predicted to break out of his prison to unleash the end times of Ragnarok, culminating in a huge battle where the supernatural non-earthly forces, along with human beings and all the demons and nature spirits from the 9 worlds, will fight in a cataclysmic battle. If you understand that, you understand why the SS had no fear going into massive battles. That's blitzkrieg right there and then. It's been perverted, but that's blitzkrieg, that's lightning war. And you see what a powerful archetype the Ragnarok idea is to tap into. Now, the system of writing developed by the Vikings, the runes, was also adapted by the Anglo-Saxons. It was very different than the kind of writing we associate today. These were essentially pictures but they were more than just letters. They were true spells. They had true magical powers, and each rune symbol carried with it a charge, shall we say, a very powerful magical charge. And this system of writing is basically contained within 3 periods. The earliest forms were found about 150 AD, but they may have been around before that. It's just that nothing has survived. But we do have samples of runic script from 150 AD. It lasted until about 1100 AD. Now, it lasted, shall we say, in the common tongue until 1100 AD. But then something very interesting happens, as we learn all through history, where anything that has a magical or a supernaturally charged quality about it is taken away from the laity, from the commoners, from the ordinary people, but is retained by the aristocrats. And then the aristocrats will basically coach the common people to consider what was originally their own native wisdom to be either blasphemy or crazy superstition, but they will continue to use it themselves. The complicated system of the runes gave the early women practitioners, and these would have been after 1100 AD. What happened was that women, what would have been basically considered witches at the time, continued on the runic tradition after the Roman alphabet had come in and dominated the literary societies or the literate societies from that point on. The complicated system of the runes gave the early women practitioners incredible powers within their community, and may even have been a counterbalance to the power that the knights enjoyed at the same time. A motif emerges here of female witches and male knights, with tales of male knights often being cursed by the runes, leading them to be struck down in battle. This is very common in the Grail mysteries, particularly in the Teutonic countries. The use and fear of the runes created ran through all strata of Teutonic society. The term rune is derived from the Old Low German dialect, meaning to scratch or to cut into. So you're literally cutting in or scratching the runic design into a piece of stone or into a piece of wood. But you're not only just writing, you're also charging it with your emotional infusion into the actual act of cutting or scratching. Later on, the mysteries of the runes moved from the early female practitioners to males involved in the clerical and legal professions. As I was saying, they take it over and call it witchcraft for everyone else, but they're all using it in secrecy. And also around this time, the runes moved from being carved into wood and stone, written in stone, to being written into books and on documents. Even among the early Christian educated classes, the runes still retained a sense of awe that in order to decipher their secrets, coupled with using them correctly, they could unleash powerful streams of energetic forces towards their desired object. As the rune script became more and more incorporated into the educated classes and further away from the peasants, its power was believed to be even greater due to the decreasing numbers of ordinary folk who understood the potential of the runes. That's a direct quote from my book, Valpurgis Night, Volume 1. Now, because I delivered this lecture in Yorkshire, in Hebden Bridge, people were asking me, well, what does York mean? What has York got to do with it? Because there seems to be a bit of a Viking fever going on there. Well, the answer to that is Jorvik. That was the most important Viking city on that coast Now remember, the Viking world didn't orientate itself very differently. It would have seen the New World as Scotland, Ireland and Wales. So York would have been like the New York, ironically. And it's not by accident, of the Viking New World. Dublin would have been like Los Angeles, and these cities would have been looked upon in that way. All trade led towards them. They were the land of opportunity. Before it was called Jorvik, it was called Ibor ar Crum, from the Gaelic Ibarach, which depends on if Scots or Irish Gaelic, which means the land of yew trees. Very kind of interesting too, considering, yew trees, Yorkshire, Savile, and so on. To bring in a synchronistically some of my other work. In 866, Vikings captured York and transformed it into Jorvik, into a major trading port on the eastern side of the North Sea. It was an independent Viking city-state until Eric Bloodaxe, what a great name, surrendered Jorvik in AD 954 to King Edred as part of a consolidation of England as a kingdom. You see, this was interesting too. The consolidation of England as one unified nation came about basically from the piecemeal destruction of both Nordic and Celtic communities. Now, we can't talk about the Vikings without talking about their sagas and epics. And my God, what a phenomenal literary and storytelling archive they have left us. The Icelandic sagas alone are just wonderful to read. You have stories ranging from basically early forms of psychoanalysis, long before Sigmund Freud and a bunch of other oddballs got together in Vienna at the turn of the last century. You had kings providing counselling in a psychoanalytical sense to their people. You had other stories revolved around the idea of revenge, not always being a good thing, but totally understandable. And some of these stories took place in Iceland that are still remote to this day, yet 1,000+ years ago. They were very well known and explored to these people, and yet derived from that this phenomenal literary and story archive. Now, Beowulf, which isn't strictly Nordic, but it definitely is. The story takes place between Denmark and Sweden. So, for the sake of inclusion, I've put it in here because it is very similar to, if you read the poem, you get a very good insight into how our ancestors were by the flow of language. Some of the translations are better than others. Grendel is compared to a gorilla in one translation I have, which is totally inaccurate because gorillas would have been unknown then. The Seamus Heaney translation of Beowulf is excellent. You read Beowulf and the Icelandic sagas, and I guarantee you it will actually give you a shift in consciousness. It will change you into a pre-biblical, pre-Abrahamic mindset, and you'll find that your life is a lot easier once you get the Christian, the Jew, or the Muslim out of your system. I'm talking about if you're a European. Nothing against these religions, but they don't belong in Europe. They don't work here. They only work here by force. So it brings up the question, why do we need a Bible, classical or Abrahamic influence in Northern Europe? And the fact is we don't. We already have it in this phenomenal archive of not just only Nordic and Viking stories, but also derivatives and similar kind of ideas from the Gaelic, the Celtic, and the Teutonic specifically, and Anglo-Saxon world. We don't need to import the wisdom of Solomon. We have far greater wisdoms more tailored to us here that don't involve cultivating demons inside the temple. And as I said, the royal families and religions need this Abrahamic infection, and that's what it is. One God in the sky, one God on the earth, and that's your king or your queen or your pope. And so that's basically it. The Vikings were not bastards. They were a phenomenal race. Like every other race, they had their good sides and their bad sides, but if you study them objectively without the Christian propaganda, you will see a lot more good to embrace than bad. And you might discover that your own culture as a Northern European was taken from you, and that may be your own journey back to a kind of Asgard of your own. Thank you.